Cops humiliate elderly black man, but one call changes everything. An unexpected phone call to the police station was about to change everything. Who could have imagined that a simple call would alter the fate of so many lives on that fateful evening in Chicago? It was a typical Wednesday, February 22, 2025. The summer heat bore down on the city streets as Mr. Johnson, a 68-year-old black man, slowly walked through the Bronzeville neighborhood. Retired after years of working as a janitor, he was enjoying the afternoon by doing his grocery shopping at the corner store. Before we continue, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to never miss any of our heartwarming stories. And in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from. Your participation means a lot to us. What Mr. Johnson didn't know was that his routine walk was about to turn into a nightmare. Two police officers, known in the neighborhood for their aggressive behavior, brutally stopped him without apparent reason. "Hands on your head, old man. Show us your ID," one of the officers yelled, pushing Mr. Johnson against the wall. The old man, frightened and confused, tried to explain that he had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years, but his words fell on deaf ears. Meanwhile, at the local police station, Captain Sarah received a mysterious call. The voice on the other end sounded nervous and urgent. "Captain, you need to see something immediately. It's about officers who are... well, you need to see this with your own eyes." Back at the scene of the stop, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The officers, ignoring Mr. Johnson's pleas and the protests of passers-by who were beginning to gather, continued their public humiliation. "I bet this old guy has a record. He must have stolen all that money he's carrying," the second officer insinuated, rummaging through the old man's pockets. Tears rolled down Mr. Johnson's wrinkled face, mixing with the sweat caused by the heat and fear. He thought about his late wife, his grandchildren waiting for him at home, and the respect he had always had for the law. How could this be happening to him? The crowd around them was growing, with murmurs of indignation and cell phones pointed at the scene. The tension in the air was palpable, threatening to explode at any moment. At that instant, sirens began to wail in the distance. Had someone called for backup? The officers detaining Mr. Johnson exchanged nervous glances but maintained their aggressive attitude. What no one knew was that Captain Sarah was on her way, with information that could completely change the course of this situation. But what had she discovered? And how would it affect the fate of Mr. Johnson and the officers involved? As the sirens drew closer, a question hung in the air. Are some injustices destined to remain unpunished? Or does the truth always find a way to come to light? The Bronzeville neighborhood, known for its rich African-American history and vibrant community, was witnessing a scene that starkly contrasted with its usual warmth and resilience. The colorful murals depicting civil rights leaders and local heroes seemed to watch the unfolding drama with silent concern. As tensions rose, bystanders began to pull out their phones, live streaming the incident. Social media was already buzzing with hashtags like "Justice for Johnson" and "Don Bronzeville Strong." The incident was quickly becoming more than just a local issue. It was turning into a flashpoint for the ongoing national conversation about police reform and racial justice. In the growing crowd, a young activist named Zoe, known for her work with the local Black Lives Matter chapter, started to organize the onlookers. "Remember, stay calm but document everything," she shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos. As the scene unfolded, the weight of history hung heavy in the air. Bronzeville, once known as the Black Metropolis, had been a beacon of African-American achievement and resilience for generations. Now on its streets, a new chapter in the long struggle for equality was being written. The question on everyone's mind was, would this be just another instance of injustice, or could it become a catalyst for real change? The Bronzeville neighborhood, once a hub of the Great Migration and a cradle of African-American culture, was witnessing a scene that starkly contrasted with its rich history of resilience and achievement. The vibrant murals depicting jazz legends and civil rights heroes seemed to watch the unfolding drama with silent concern. Walter Johnson, born and raised in Mississippi, had come to Chicago during the tail end of the Great Migration, carrying with him dreams of a better life. Over the decades, he had built his life in this corner of the South Side, becoming a respected figure in the community. His work as a janitor at the local community center had earned him the affection of residents who saw him as a gentle guardian of the neighborhood. The two officers who were detaining him, however, were strangers to this reality. Sergeant Mike Brennan, 32, was known among his colleagues for his aggressive approach. Raised in a predominantly white suburb of Chicago, Mike had joined the force with promises to clean up the streets, but years of frustration and a system he deemed too lenient had transformed him into a bitter version of his initial ideals. His partner, Officer Kevin Sullivan, 26, was new to the force. Fresh out of the academy, Kevin saw Mike as a role model, absorbing his attitudes without question. This afternoon he felt a mix of adrenaline and unease, torn between loyalty to his partner and an inner voice questioning the situation. Meanwhile, at the police station, Captain Sarah Rodriguez, 45, was known for her unwavering integrity. The daughter of Mexican immigrants, Sarah had grown up believing in justice and the power of community policing. Her career in the Chicago Police Department had been marked by meticulous investigations and a relentless pursuit of truth. The call Sarah had received came from Jamal, a 19-year-old college student who had witnessed the beginning of Mr. Johnson's detention. Raised by his grandmother in the same neighborhood, Jamal knew the old man by sight and had been shocked by the violence of the scene. With trembling hands, he had filmed the incident and, remembering his grandmother's advice about doing what's right, decided to contact the authorities. On the street, the crowd forming reflected the diversity of the neighborhood. Longtime residents of various backgrounds mingled with young students and local business owners. Among them was Mrs. Washington, 75, owner of a soul food restaurant. She watched the scene with a mixture of horror and determination, recalling the stories of discrimination her parents had told her about their early days in Chicago. The tension in the air was palpable. Some people were shouting their protests, while others were silently filming with their phones. The aroma of barbecue from a nearby restaurant mixed with the acrid smell of fear and indignation. Mr. Johnson, backed against the cold wall, felt the weight of a lifetime of struggles and perseverance. He remembered his late wife, Bessie, and how she always said that dignity was a man's most precious possession. At that moment, he was fighting not just against present humiliation, but against decades of silent prejudice he had faced. The officers, Mike and Kevin, continued their aggressive stop, but something in the air had changed. The sound of approaching sirens brought a new element to the scene. Mike, the more experienced one, felt a chill down his spine. Something was deviating from the usual script. In the speeding police car, Captain Sarah mentally reviewed the information she had received. The video Jamal had sent her was shocking, but she knew she had to keep her cool and act with precision. Years of experience had taught her that situations like this could quickly spiral out of control. As the police car approached the scene of the incident, the blue and red lights reflected off the facades of historic brownstones, creating a surreal kaleidoscope. Night was falling on Chicago, and with it the promise that the events of this afternoon would have consequences that no one could foresee. Zoe, the young activist, was rallying the crowd, urging them to remain peaceful but vigilant. "We are witnesses to history," she called out, her voice steady and clear. "Let's show the world that Bronzeville stands united against injustice." In the growing crowd, faces reflected a mix of emotions: anger, fear, determination. Many were live-streaming the event, ensuring that what was happening would be seen far beyond the confines of their neighborhood. As Captain Sarah's car screeched to a halt at the scene, the air was charged with expectation. How would her arrival affect the fate of Mr. Johnson, the officers involved, and the community as a whole? The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of community resilience, police accountability, and the possibility of change in a city long divided by racial tensions. As the crowd held its collective breath, one question hung in the air. Could this moment become a turning point in the long struggle for justice and equality in America? Captain Sarah's car screeched to a halt, its tires leaving marks on the asphalt. She stepped out of the vehicle with determination, her eyes quickly scanning the scene. The contrast between her commanding presence and the chaos of the situation was palpable. "What's going on here?" Captain Sarah's voice cut through the air like a knife. Officers Mike and Kevin turned, surprised. Mr. Johnson, still pinned against the wall, felt a glimmer of hope. "Captain, we're just conducting a routine stop," Mike responded, trying to maintain his composure. Sarah approached, her eyes fixed on Mr. Johnson. "Sir, are you all right?" Before Johnson could answer, Mike intervened. "With all due respect, Captain, this is under the jurisdiction of our precinct. Your presence isn't necessary here." The crowd around them murmured, cell phones still pointed at the scene. The tension was palpable. Sarah ignored Mike and addressed Mr. Johnson directly. "Please, tell me what happened." In a trembling voice, Johnson began to recount the events. As he spoke, his voice gained strength. "I was just doing my shopping like I do every Wednesday for years. Suddenly I was stopped, pushed against the wall. They didn't even let me explain." Kevin, the younger officer, was visibly becoming uncomfortable. His eyes darted between Mr. Johnson, his partner Mike, and Captain Sarah. At that moment, Jamal, the young student who had made the report, stepped forward from the crowd. "I saw everything, Captain. I have the video here on my phone." Mike, realizing the situation was slipping out of his control, tried to regain it. "This is absurd. We're just doing our job. This man was acting suspiciously." Mike's statement provoked a wave of indignation from the crowd. Mrs. Washington, the soul food restaurant owner, couldn't contain herself. "Suspicious behavior? I've known Mr. Johnson for decades. He's more a part of this neighborhood than you'll ever be." The situation was on the brink of exploding. Sarah, sensing the danger, raised her hands to call for silence. "Let's all calm down. This will be resolved, but we need to maintain order." She turned to the officers. "You two, release Mr. Johnson immediately and accompany me to the station. We have a lot to discuss." Mike, seeing his authority crumble, attempted one last act of defiance. "You don't have authority over us, Captain. I'm not going anywhere." It was at this moment that Kevin, the younger partner, made a decision that would change the course of events. "That's enough, Mike. This has gone too far." He turned to Sarah. "Captain, I'm sorry. I'll cooperate with the investigation." The crowd watched the scene in tense silence as the drama unfolded. Mr. Johnson, finally released, staggered slightly. Mrs. Washington and other neighbors rushed to support him. Sarah, keeping her calm, addressed Mike. "You have two options. Come voluntarily or be escorted by force. The choice is yours." Mike, feeling cornered, finally yielded. The air of arrogance on his face gave way to an expression of defeat. As the officers were escorted to the police car, Sarah approached Mr. Johnson. "Sir, I'm deeply sorry for what you've endured. I promise you this won't go unpunished." Johnson, still shaken, nodded with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Captain. You know, for a moment I thought nobody cared about an old man like me." Jamal, the young student, approached timidly. "Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry I didn't intervene directly, but I couldn't stand by and do nothing in the face of this injustice." Sarah smiled at Jamal. "You did the right thing, young man. Your act of courage made all the difference today." As the situation calmed, the Bronzeville community rallied around Mr. Johnson. Neighbors offered words of comfort, while others animatedly discussed how to prevent such situations from happening again. Zoe, the young activist, seized the moment. "This is why we need community oversight of the police," she called out. "We need to turn this moment into lasting change." Her words resonated with many in the crowd, sparking impromptu discussions about police reform and community empowerment. As the police car drove away with the officers inside, Sarah knew the night would be long. There was much work to do, testimonies to collect, reports to write, a full investigation to conduct. But something had changed that evening. A small victory against injustice had been won, thanks to the courage of a young man, the determination of a captain, and the resilience of an old man who had refused to be silenced. As the streetlights flickered on in Bronzeville, casting long shadows on the historic buildings, there was a sense that this incident could be more than just another statistic. It could be the spark that ignited real change. Mrs. Washington, her voice carrying the weight of generations, spoke up. "This neighborhood has seen its share of struggles, but we've always come out stronger. This time, we're not just fighting for ourselves, but for the future of our community and our relationship with those sworn to protect us." Her words seemed to galvanize the crowd. Impromptu committees were forming, plans being made for community meetings, and strategies discussed for engaging with city officials. As the night deepened, the energy in Bronzeville remained electric. The incident with Mr. Johnson had touched a nerve, bringing to the surface long-simmering frustrations, but also igniting a fierce determination for change. Captain Sarah, observing the community's response, felt a mix of hope and trepidation. She knew that the coming days and weeks would be crucial. The path to reform would be challenging, facing resistance not just from within the police force, but from a system often resistant to change. As she prepared to leave, Sarah caught Mr. Johnson's eye. The old man's gaze held a question that echoed in her own mind. Would this time be different? Could this incident truly be the catalyst for lasting change? The answer lay in the hands of not just the police or the politicians, but in the collective will of the community that was now awakening to its own power. In the days following the incident, the Bronzeville neighborhood was buzzing with discussions and actions. Mr. Johnson's story had struck a chord in the community, triggering a series of interconnected events. Jamal, the young student whose report had been crucial, had become a reluctant local hero. His grandmother, Mrs. Taylor, couldn't contain her pride. "My grandson, I always knew you had a heart of gold," she would say to anyone who would listen at the beauty salon where she had worked for decades. However, not everything was rosy for Jamal. Some of his college classmates accused him of causing trouble. "What if the police start harassing us because of this?" one of them wondered. Jamal found himself torn between pride in doing what was right and fear of possible repercussions. Meanwhile, at the police station, the investigation was taking more complex turns. Captain Sarah discovered that Mike, the more aggressive officer, had a history of complaints about abuse of authority. However, all had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Kevin, the younger partner, was cooperating fully. His revelations about the culture of intimidation within certain sectors of the police force were troubling. "I joined the force to help people," he confided to Sarah during an emotional deposition. "How did we end up here?" The pressure on Sarah to bury the case was growing. One morning she received a call from a high-ranking official. "Sarah, are you sure you want to go through with this? Think carefully about the consequences for your career." These words weighed heavily on Sarah. She had a daughter to raise on her own and a mortgage to pay. The temptation to give in was strong, but the image of Mr. Johnson, humiliated and frightened, wouldn't leave her mind. In the neighborhood, Mrs. Washington had become a driving force for change. She organized a community meeting at the local cultural center. "We can't let fear paralyze us," she declared to a packed room. "It's time to unite and demand respect and safety for all." Among those present was Mr. Johnson. Initially reluctant to expose himself again, he had been persuaded by his grandchildren to attend the meeting. "Grandpa, your story can help other people," his eldest granddaughter, Aisha, a law student, had insisted. When Mr. Johnson finally stood up to speak, the silence in the room was palpable. In a voice that trembled at first but gained strength with each word, he shared not only the recent incident, but decades of microaggressions and subtle discrimination he had faced. "I don't want revenge," he concluded. "I want change. I want my grandchildren to grow up in a world where they won't be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." His words deeply touched those present. Silent tears rolled down many faces, and a sense of collective determination filled the air. Meanwhile, local media began to take interest in the story. A young journalist, Lisa Chen, sensing an important topic, began to investigate patterns of police stops in the area. Her initial findings were alarming. There was a clear racial disparity in stops and arrests. As pressure mounted, the group realized they needed decisive action to consolidate the changes and prove their value to the community. It was Zoe, the young activist, who proposed the bold idea. What if we organized a big community event? Something that would show the unity between the police and the community, that would demonstrate the real benefits of these changes. The idea quickly gained traction. A street festival was planned, combining cultural performances, workshops on civil rights and community safety, and opportunities for open dialogue between residents and police officers. As preparations for the event progressed, tension in the city reached its peak. Opponents of the reforms saw the festival as a perfect opportunity to discredit the entire movement. Sarah received another anonymous call. "They're going to try something during the festival. Be ready." The group met one last time on the eve of the big day. The air was charged with apprehension and determination. "Tomorrow will be the final test," Sarah declared. "Everything we've fought for will be at stake." Mr. Johnson, with a gleam in his eyes, added, "But it's also our greatest opportunity to show that change is possible, that together we are stronger." As night fell on Chicago, the protagonists of this story prepared for what could be the most important day of their lives. The next day's festival wouldn't just be a celebration, but a battle for the future of the city. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the fate of the reforms and potentially the future of police-community relations in Chicago. The day of the festival dawned with palpable tension in the air. The streets of Bronzeville, normally quiet in the early morning hours, were already buzzing with activity. Volunteers scurried about, setting up booths, hanging banners, and checking sound equipment. Mr. Johnson, despite his advanced age, had been up since dawn, overseeing preparations with a mixture of anxiety and determination in his tired eyes. By his side, Mrs. Washington organized a team of elderly neighborhood residents, all wearing T-shirts emblazoned with "Wisdom of the Streets." Jamal and his group of citizen watchdogs formed a discreet cordon around the festival perimeter, alert to any suspicious movement. Journalist Lisa Chen, with her team in place, prepared to broadcast the event live across the city. As the morning progressed, the crowd began to form. Families, young people, elderly, the entire neighborhood seemed to have descended into the streets. But mingled with the crowd, keen eyes might have noticed suspicious figures, observing and whispering among themselves. The crucial moment arrived when police cars began to arrive. Led by Captain Sarah, the officers emerged from their vehicles not with their usual rigid demeanor, but with cautious smiles and extended hands to greet residents. It was at this moment that the first spark of tension ignited. A group of protesters, clearly organized, began chanting slogans against the reforms. "We want security, not hugs," and "Police are here to arrest, not to play." The crowd became agitated, and for a moment it seemed that chaos might ensue. That's when Mr. Johnson, with energy defying his age, climbed onto the central stage. "My friends," his trembling but firm voice resonated through the speakers, "don't let fear divide us. Look around you. See your neighbors, your families. This is our community, and these police officers, they're part of it too." A tense silence fell over the crowd. Seizing the moment, Captain Sarah joined Mr. Johnson on stage. "We're here to serve and protect. Not against you, but with you. Give us a chance to prove it." Suddenly, a scream tore through the air. "He's armed!" Someone in the crowd was pointing at one of the protesters opposed to the reforms. Panic threatened to set in, but before anyone could react, Jamal and his group of citizen watchdogs had already surrounded the suspect. To everyone's surprise, it wasn't a weapon, but a megaphone that the man was trying to conceal. Sarah, who had been observing everything closely, quickly took control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, stay calm. There's no real threat here. What we're seeing is an attempt to create panic and discredit everything we've fought for." At this critical moment, something extraordinary happened. An elderly man in the crowd approached a young police officer. "Son," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for being here today." This simple gesture seemed to break the tension. Gradually, other residents began to approach the police officers, striking up conversations, sharing stories. Lisa Chen, capturing the moment, was broadcasting everything live. "We're witnessing something incredible here today," she narrated, emotion in her voice. "This isn't just a festival, it's the birth of a new form of community." As the day progressed, the festival came to life. Police officers participated in games with children, elderly people taught young officers about the neighborhood's history, and diverse groups mingled in animated discussions about the future of community safety. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to set, Mr. Johnson, Sarah, Kevin, Jamal, Lisa, and Mrs. Washington gathered at the center of the festival. Looking around them, they saw the fruit of their efforts, a united community, bridges being built where there were once walls. "We did it," whispered Sarah, tears in her eyes. "No," Mr. Johnson gently corrected, "we've just begun. The real work starts now." As the festival lights came on against the night sky, it was clear that this day marked not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new era for Chicago, an era of dialogue, mutual understanding, and true partnership between the police and the community. News of the festival's success spread quickly through the city, inspiring other neighborhoods to follow suit. Resistance to the reforms hadn't completely disappeared, but it had been significantly weakened by this public demonstration of unity and progress. The climax came as the festival reached its final hours. A group of hardline opponents, realizing their efforts to disrupt had failed, attempted one last desperate move. They tried to storm the stage during the closing ceremony, shouting accusations and threats. But what happened next would be remembered for years to come. As the agitators pushed forward, they found themselves face to face not with police officers, but with a human chain of community members, young and old, of all races and backgrounds. Leading this chain were Mr. Johnson and Captain Sarah, standing side by side. "This is our community," Mr. Johnson's voice rang out strong and clear, "and we choose unity over division, hope over fear." The would-be disruptors, faced with this wall of solidarity, faltered and then retreated. The crowd erupted in cheers. not of triumph over an enemy, but of joy in their newfound strength and unity. As the final notes of music echoed through the streets of Bronzeville that night, a sense of hope hung in the air. A powerful lesson had been learned. True change doesn't come through decrees or laws, but through the collective effort of individuals committed to a better future. The festival hadn't just been a celebration, it had been a turning point. Bronzeville, and perhaps Chicago as a whole, would never be the same again. In the weeks and months that followed the festival, the waves of change continued to ripple through Chicago. The Bronzeville event had become a tipping point, not just for the neighborhood but for the entire city. Captain Sarah, now recognized as one of the key architects of police reform, was invited to lead a training program at the national level. Her goal, to teach the new generation of police officers to work in partnership with the communities they had sworn to protect. Kevin, inspired by the success of the festival, proposed the creation of community partnership centers in every police station. These spaces became meeting places where residents and police officers could discuss local issues, plan joint initiatives, and build mutual trust. Jamal expanded his citizen watchdog program to other neighborhoods, always emphasizing cooperation with the police rather than confrontation. His motto, "Observe, report, cooperate," became a mantra for communities across the city. Lisa Chen, the journalist, continued to cover the evolution of the reforms, but now with a focus on positive stories of change. Her series, Guardians of the Community, highlighted police officers and citizens who were making a difference in their neighborhoods. Mrs. Washington, with her inexhaustible energy, transformed her soul food restaurant into a true community center. There, in addition to delicious food, residents could find information about their rights, participate in safety workshops, and even enjoy meditation sessions to relieve urban stress. The impact of the changes began to be reflected in the statistics. Crime rates, after a brief initial increase, began to steadily decline. More importantly, public trust in the police reached record levels. As for Mr. Johnson, he became an almost legendary figure in the city. Invited to give lectures at schools, universities, and even the police academy, he always carried a message of hope and reconciliation. One quiet afternoon, almost a year after the festival, Mr. Johnson sat on his favorite bench in Bronzeville Square. Observing the comings and goings of residents, police officers patrolling on foot and chatting amicably with shopkeepers, he couldn't help but smile. Sarah, passing through the square, noticed the old man and sat down next to him. "What are you thinking about, Mr. Johnson?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking," he replied, eyes twinkling, "that sometimes the greatest opportunities are born from the most difficult situations. Look at our city now. Who would have thought that terrible day would lead to all this?" Sarah nodded, moved. "You taught us a valuable lesson, Mr. Johnson. Real change begins when we refuse to be victims of circumstances and choose to be agents of transformation." As the sun set over Chicago, bathing the streets of Bronzeville in a golden glow, it was clear that the city hadn't just overcome a crisis, but had emerged stronger, more united, and more hopeful than ever. The journey wasn't over. It never would be. But the foundations for a better future had been laid, built on the pillars of mutual respect, understanding, and the courage of ordinary individuals who had refused to accept injustice as inevitable. 5 years after the events that transformed Chicago, the city celebrated the anniversary of the reforms. In Bronzeville Square, a statue was unveiled, Mr. Johnson hand in hand with a police officer and a child, symbolizing the union between generations and institutions. Although Mr. Johnson was no longer with them, having passed away peacefully the previous year, his legacy lived on in every corner of the city. Chicago's community policing model had become a national and international reference. As the city continued to evolve, facing new challenges, one thing remained constant: the belief that together the community and authorities could build a fairer and safer future for all. And so, dear viewers, we come to the end of this moving journey. Mr. Johnson's story and Chicago's transformation remind us that true change begins with each one of us. If you've watched this far, don't forget to comment, "I watched until the end," to show us that this message has touched your heart. How about bringing this inspiration to your own community? Start small but dream big. Every gesture of understanding, every action of cooperation can be the beginning of a great transformation. Don't forget to click on the video in the end screen for more inspiring stories like this one. Together, we can make a difference.